This is really an honor for me because, Dan, you represent courage in action. It's one thing to see your government wantonly risking destroying lives and speaking out against it. That takes some degree of courage, and there are many people in this room I can see who have done such deeds. It's another thing to speak out and risk 115 years in jail. It's another thing to speak out and know that your government is going to prosecute you. It's another thing to have just gotten married to an incredibly beautiful woman, have 2 wonderful children from a previous marriage, and make the decision to give up what would be a beautiful life for country, for justice, for the world. So I want to bring you back to the moment when you made that decision and how you got there, the decision to release the Pentagon Papers.
Well, I'd learned in the summer of 1969, in the new administration of Richard Nixon, that Nixon did not intend to end the war without essentially winning it by keeping General Tew, President Tew, in power. We now know, by the way, something that none of us knew at the time, that Tew felt he had won the election for Nixon by following his advice not to go to Paris to join negotiations under Johnson in November of 1968, which was a prospect that was increasing Humphrey's polls day by day till he was actually even with Nixon and ready to surpass them. But when Nixon secretly advised Tew not to go to Paris, there would be no negotiations, Humphrey's support leveled off immediately and he lost very narrowly. I believe, there's no question in my mind, that Nixon felt indebted to Tew, and at any rate that he knew Tew felt Nixon should be indebted to him, and I would say had blackmail over Nixon, something I haven't seen anyone mention in connection with this. We're hearing a counterpart to that today, but in fact here was a foreign power who could have revealed at any time that he had been urged to, by a Republican candidate, not to take part in negotiations toward ending the war so that the Republican candidate would win and give him a better deal later. That's what happened in November of '68. In fact, Nixon was very concerned that that would come out from the materials I was revealing at that point. That's a little known aspect of this thing. But anyway, I worked for Nixon in the beginning of '69, not knowing this, and the end of '68, and learned through my contacts in the White House that he was not willing to see Tew part of a coalition government or out of power. That was a sticking point in negotiations. Very few people, by the way, seem to have asked the question, why did it take him so long to get out of the war? Why was it so hard to end the war? Why did more than 20,000 Americans die under Nixon?
Yes.
Exactly, because he's given credit for ending the war. Well, the answer is that Nixon was implacable on the point that Tew must not be excluded from the government as the Hanoi regime was demanding until 1973. So the war went on. I knew that he intended to escalate the war, to carry out threats. I was sure his threats of nuclear attack, secret threats, would not succeed in ending the war. I was afraid he would carry them out. And other escalations, mining Haiphong, sending troops into Cambodia and Laos and others, that he was threatening as early as 1969. So that was one thing. I knew the war was going to go on and get larger.
Despite the fact the American public were being told otherwise.
They were being told, had been told in the campaign that he intended to end the war with honor. And to most people, including myself, by the way, that meant some kind of face-saving frosting on the negotiations that would allow us to get out.
Didn't Johnson also tell the American people that he wanted to end the war when he ran for election?
Go back to 1964, the election there ran on 2 issues. One, a nuclear issue of delegation of authority to use nuclear weapons that Senator General Goldwater was saying that generals in the field should have authorization from the president to use nuclear weapons. Johnson denied that he ever would give such a delegation. I knew he had.
That
and
was
I reported
a lie.
that was a lie.
So there was a lie on Vietnam?
That was one lie. But on Vietnam, on his first day in the campaign, forever on, he said, "We seek no wider war." Goldwater, again, was calling openly for a wider war, bombing and troops. Johnson was saying, "We seek no wider war." He was elected in a landslide on that basis. I knew inside the Pentagon from my first day, which happened to be the day of the Tonkin Gulf raids, August 4th, 1964, but I knew within days we sought a wider war, and that the war would widen shortly after the election. I'll tell you, on election day, I didn't vote, nor did anybody around the table in the State Department where I was working. We didn't have time to go vote. We were discussing different ways of widening the war on election day.
While the public was voting to end the
in an
war.
unprecedented landslide for the man who said he would not widen the war. And the question was, how many targets did you hit? Would we hit? Would we go all the way as Goldwater wanted, and so forth?
So this period of time after you had seen Johnson deceive the American public.
Now Nixon was doing it.
After you had seen the falsehood of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that empowered Johnson to expand the war, that we all now know was based on lies, that there wasn't an attack, it was just straight up falsehood. You were in the government, working, studying deeply Vietnam. You had gone to Vietnam for several years. You had been a Marine. You had been a Marine before that. You had been in the armed forces. And you knew that what was going on. How did you know all this? What was your status that you would know all of these secrets?
Well, actually, I had been working on nuclear war planning for some years before that, and had been doing a study of decision-making in nuclear crises, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, of which I'd been a part in 1962. And so I'd had access to all this material for a long time. I was brought in by John T. McNaughton, a former Harvard law professor, some of you might have known at Harvard, who is now Assistant Secretary of Defense. And he said, "You're studying decision-making in nuclear crises." Vietnam didn't look to us then as a nuclear crisis, though it actually was more than we knew. But he said, Vietnam is a continuous crisis. You'll learn much more inside the government than you can possibly learn outside. So my first day as his special assistant, and this was a coincidence, was the day that Johnson and Kennedy announced at the end of the day that we were conducting an unprovoked attack on North Vietnamese patrol boats in international waters. Our destroyers were on a routine patrol when they were attacked, and that there was this unequivocal evidence of all this, and that we are giving a one-time retaliatory attack against the bases that had attacked us, this like one-off expression that we just heard in Syria, and that we seek no wider war. Within 2 days, I knew that each of those was a conscious lie. That very night, I already knew there was very great doubt as to whether there had been an attack, far from unequivocal evidence. That's arising a little bit, by the way, about the gas attack so far, and certainly about the last one. As James Mattis has just said, we still don't know for sure whether the attack to which we responded at the beginning of the year was an Assad gas attack. Mattis mentioned that. Now, some questions are arising about Duma, but we haven't settled all those. But at any rate, the word unequivocal evidence was a flat lie. Actually, there had been no attack. There was evidence, but it was wrong. It was misleading. There had been no attack. International waters, they were moving out of the coastal waters of North Vietnam in the belief they were about to be attacked, which they actually weren't. Unprovoked, we had been attacking North Vietnam covertly, secretly, the night before, as we had the night before the actual attack on August 2nd. So this looked like another provoked attack, if there was an attack at all. And finally, the one I didn't know for another day or two, the wider war, the Pentagon was totally involved in plans for widening the war, both on the ground and in the air. The public was totally misled about that, and I knew it at that point right away as the special assistant. I was a GS-18, Some of you know what that is, the highest civil service rank.
Explain the level of secrecy
Yeah.
that you had and the fact that the reports that you were creating were so secret that even the president wasn't given them. It was stayed
Well,
with
that
him.
was on the nuclear war plans earlier as a consultant. But Eisenhower's war plans were not shared with McNamara until I got it. That's in my book here, Doomsday Machine. But in terms of clearances, I did ask to come in at GS-18 level because of the nuclear work that I'd been doing for some years before that. Very unusual to come in at that level. And when I went to Vietnam, I switched over to State Department, which is FSR-1. Yeah.
Dan, well, first, it was your 87th birthday last week. The fact that you can remember the detailed events which are corroborated with extraordinary accuracy in footnotes, extensive footnotes in 2 books that I want everyone to read called Secrets, a memoir of Vietnam and the Pentagon Papers with extensive footnotes, and the Doomsday Machine, which we'll talk about, is evidence that if you want to have a great memory and be sharp as a tack, do something ridiculously ambitious.
Well,
but could you explain the arcane status of a G18 to the normal person?
By the way, I do have a good memory for these events, as documents show. Don't ask me what I had for dinner yesterday, or what movie I saw last week.
What is a G18? What does that mean?
It's the GS-18, a lot of people here know, but it's the highest civil servant super grade, and it has the military equivalent, the code between a major general 2-star and a lieutenant general 3-star. And that was on my, when I was in FSR-1, the same Foreign Service Reserve 1, that was on my identity card, Lieutenant General. And one day in particular, when I happened to be observing from the point against the machine gun nest in South Vietnam, I'm just laughing here, but I was thinking, when they pull my body out of this rice paddy, they're going to be surprised what they've got here at that identity card. But there
weren't a lot. Wait a second, Dan.
That didn't give me the clearance.
There weren't a lot of guys walking point with G18 status.
None that I know of.
No. So when you were doing studies of Vietnam, when Dan was doing studies of Vietnam, he actually went out and ran point on nighttime missions. So it wasn't just studying the papers. He spent 2 years in the field in Vietnam, and we're going to come back to. So you have access to all the secrets.
That of course, none of that gave me the access precisely. The special assistant to the assistant secretary.
That's what did it.
I asked for all the clearances that he had above top secret. I'd had top secret for years, and that meant a dozen other clearances higher than top secret. And as some of you know, in previous days, there was hardly any secret more sensitive and better kept than the fact that there were clearances higher than top secret. That is not the case now. There are books about them, they're mentioned and so forth, but I had a dozen of these. And they weren't particularly needed on Tonkin Gulf, except that McNamara 4 years later, in 1968, held up 2 cables in front of the Fulbright Committee that were intercepts, communications intercepts of North Vietnamese patrol boats and their base, supposedly, he said, on August 4th, showing that there had been an attack, Now remember, there had been a daylight attack on August 2nd after we had been hitting their coast with covert raids, which McNamara falsely swore under oath were Vietnamese raids that we hardly knew anything about. They were 100% American raids run by CIA with crews from all over the Pacific that we ran entirely. And by the way, I was a high-priced courier for those cables. Later, with monthly programs of what are covert actions, they were called 34A actions, would be against North Vietnam. And they included things like capturing a fisher boat, attacking this base, hitting with 81 millimeter mortar rounds from our patrol boats. Not something that usually got initialed at the White House
Yes,
in a war.
in the grit of the war.
But this was the only war we had in '64. And then George Bundy, Vance in the #2 in Defense Department, Alexis Johnson, #2 or 3 in the State Department, had to initial these things. I carried them around for them to initial. I was a GS-18, but basically I was just explaining these things.
So
those were lied about to the Congress as being raids we knew nothing about.
So you go back, so you're working at the highest levels of security through the Johnson administration, and then into Nixon, and you see Nixon for his re-election saying one thing to the public,
Yes.
and that he's essentially doing everything he can in, quote, good faith to end the war, when in fact you know that...
By the way, I believe that he did intend to end the war and even expected to end it, because he was making threats of nuclear attack that he thought would end it, and threats of other escalation, mining Haiphong, going into the so-called sanctuaries, Laos and Cambodia. He thought those would end it. Having been in Vietnam, I didn't think so. And thus, the question was, would he carry them out? And I'd seen now that Pentagon Papers history that showed that 4 presidents in a row before him had made similar secret threats unknown to the American public and had carried them out. And I thought he would carry them out. So I saw the war getting larger. By the way, I'll tell you one thing, since we've said I brought in this business of going against him with machine gun, being walking point. That was when I was in the State Department as a civilian and I was evaluating pacification. But I'll tell you one day that made a great impression on me. I was walking point. The reason I felt able to do that was that I had been a Marine company commander during peacetime and a rifle platoon leader of a number of platoons. So I knew what to do in the field and had been in Vietnam almost 2 years at that point. So as a civilian, I'm walking with these people. And the point is, as again, many of you know, is moves ahead of the company or the platoon to draw fire, essentially, so the others can then know where the fire is coming from and attack it. So we hear shots behind us. I look behind us, and I look back, and there are 2 kids, they looked like, they might have been a little older as Vietnamese than they looked, wearing ragged shorts and carrying AK-47s. 2 of them, and they'd risen up out of the rice field and were firing at the platoon behind us, the company behind us. We couldn't fire back because at them, I'm glad to say.
Because you'd be firing...
I'm glad to say, or I would have been firing into our own company. So we had to lie low, and the fire is going over our heads. And then these 2 kids go down into the rice again and disappear. That happened time after time that day. And I thought, these people are getting up in the middle of a reinforced American battalion, air power, in the middle of it, and firing in their backyards, to be sure, so they knew every bit of cover and everything. They're firing, and they had let us walk by them, the point. They might have been feet from my feet as we splashed through that rice paddy in the rice, and waited till we went past so they could fire at the company. And I thought about that, and I thought, we aren't going to beat these guys. We are not going to win here because they're not going to give up. And that was in 1966. The war had 9 years to go. But that made a strong impression on me right there.
So we're going back to the moment you see Nixon expanding the war, you make a decision.
Yeah. A key, 2 other things. I mentioned that I knew the war was going on. Second, just in '69, I read the earliest volumes of the Pentagon Papers, which are 7,000 pages long, 47 volumes. And I put off the 45 to 53 period, which we called the French War, because I thought, you know, that's past history. I don't need to know that. I lived, of course, through the 64, 65, 66, 67 period. So I read that in the end and discovered that what the highest levels had known at that time, which I didn't know, was that what we had gone in was eventually paying 80% of the costs of a French effort to reconquer a former colony that had declared its independence. And it was always puzzling to Westmoreland and others, how come their Vietnamese are so much more committed and brave and disciplined than our Vietnamese, who are their brothers and their cousins? And the answer, when you read the Pentagon Papers, was they're fighting for independence, and our guys are fighting against independence, for foreigners. That's the difference that occurs in Afghanistan, which is how we get fired on by our Afghan troops that we're training. I wonder how many Taliban get fired on by their own troops, by the way. And not that the Taliban are good guys. And as a matter of fact, the Viet Cong leadership was a Stalinist leadership. It hasn't been well governed ever since, but it was Vietnamese and they weren't fighting for foreigners. It turns out that made a difference. So when I read this first part of the Pentagon Papers, having thought, like so many till then, that this was a good cause against Stalinists, against communists who were invading, and so forth, what this had started with the first 9 years was urging the French and supporting the French to reconquer Vietnam. That was not a noble cause from a point of view of Americans, and not just a cause that had gone wrong or was mismanaged by the Democrats or was wasteful and not very hopeful. To me, all the deaths that followed from that in 30 years, some still to come, were unjustified from an American point of view. That I won't talk about the French point of view, but from our point of view, there was no justification in that. And to me, that meant the deaths were unjustified homicide. And as the international lawyers here know, soldiers aren't to be prosecuted for taking part in an unjust war, generals maybe at Nuremberg, people higher than them. But to me, unjustified homicide was murder. And I'd been part of that. And whereas up till that point, this was 69 now, for at least 3 years since 66, I thought it's a losing effort, we should try to get out gracefully, somehow fuzz up our departure, save face in some way. Murder, I thought, was not to be ended that way, quite so patiently. And as far as I was concerned, it was something I had to do what I could to stop now, right away. And then I came to the major point, what to do about it, feeling that strongly about it. And at that point, I came face to face, by going to a conference of the War Resisters League, with young Americans who were among the 5,000 who went to prison to resist the war nonviolently and truthfully. Now, I don't know how many of you, some of you may have defended such people, and most of you, I would guess, have never met such a person. And I had never met such a person, and I would guess my colleagues, from top to finish, never did have the benefit of meeting such a person. But I saw two people, Bob Eaton and Randy Keeler, who were on their way to prison at this conference, just after the conference, for saying, not just the war is wrong, as most of the country was saying, but I won't be part of it, it's wrong, you should not participate in it, I'm ready to go to prison, and did go to prison. To not go to Sweden, not be a CO, not be National Guard Reserve, whatever, not go to Vietnam, they went to prison. And without going through all this, which is in my other book, Secrets, actually, it struck me like a thunderbolt, basically. And for the first time, the thought came into my head, having tried to end the war for at least the last 2 years, 2 or 3 years, 2 years maybe, from the inside, I thought, all right, what can I do now to help shorten this war now that I'm ready to go to prison? And the key thing there was, I think not many people are really confronted with the thought of going to prison, but it was embedded in that, giving up my career, no longer being a president's man, no longer having access, no longer holding office or working, no longer being a consultant and having my views heard at high levels. Give that up. Not many people, in fact, I didn't know anybody who actually was willing to do that. And I would not have thought of it if I hadn't met these young men who were doing exactly that. So without Randy Keeler or Bob Eaton, no Pentagon Papers. And at that point then, it wasn't the first thing to do to put out the Pentagon Papers because they ended in 1968. This was 69, Nixon, new war, new president, new Nixon. Some of you will remember, a new Nixon. That's how he got elected. Gonna end the war. So I didn't have documents on Nixon, but I thought maybe documents that show that 4 presidents in a row Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson. I worked for 3 of them, actually, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson. Wait a minute. Yeah, right, I wasn't in the Marines under Truman. Had all made the same lies that I was claiming Nixon was doing now. But I didn't have documents, but I thought maybe people will draw a line there and say it's possible we're being misled now. That failed, actually. No one that I know of read those papers and said, gee, maybe Nixon is doing the same. That was a total failure. But because they were so unanxious to believe that a president was misleading them, even if they hadn't voted for him, that you needed documents to prove it. So I made the point with the 4 previous ones, but not with Nixon.
And then Nixon overreached in going after you. And
well, Nixon acted very rationally from his point of view. He believed I had documents on nuclear policies, including his threats.
yes.
And I did have documents on a lot of nuclear policies, which I also copied at the same time, intending to put them out after the Pentagon Papers came out. I didn't have what he most feared, documents that didn't show that he was ready to drop nuclear weapons on North Vietnam. And I didn't have those because people who left the NSC during Cambodia—
The National Security Council.
National Security Council, in protest against what they saw was an illegal, unconstitutional expansion of the war in 1970. 4 of them, 5 actually, left the National Security Council, but they didn't take any documents with them. And as Roger Morris, who was an aide to Kissinger, a friend of mine, more of a friend later, said that it was his greatest shame and regret that they had not taken documents that would show why they were leaving. That Cambodia was not just that one-day aberration or something, it was part of a campaign to expand the war. He had seen photos of nuclear targets for Nixon in '69, 1.5 miles from the Chinese border on a transshipment point. He had those photos and the estimates of how much casualties there would be and so forth. And he said to me, we should have thrown open the safes and screamed bloody murder, because that's exactly what it was. That's what he said to me. That's not my paraphrase.
There's some movies and things out in the public now. There's the movie The Post that I think extols the virtue of your courage. And then there's this series that Ken Burns did on the history of Vietnam. And so I wondered, one of the things about the Ken Burns, the first couple of ones, he makes the point that we got into Vietnam based on good faith, that people were trying to do the right thing. And in the Post movie, I noticed they never talk about the substance of the Pentagon Papers.
No, The Post is a good movie. How many people have seen it, actually? Most of you have seen it. Good movie, right, I think. And people asked me how I thought of my portrayal. I said, very nice to be portrayed by somebody who looks much the way I did then, only better. And so that was fine. And my wife agreed. Yeah, but that's good. It's a Hollywood movie. It's not a documentary. There's a lot I can't vouch for, but I know there's a lot that's fictional in it. In my case, well, there's 2 things missing. One is a reasonable dramatic decision. It's about Kay Graham, and it's about the release, and it's about the fight with the Supreme Court. So it ends very triumphantly. It's a success story with the Supreme Court voting 6-3 to allow the Post and the Times and 17 other papers to whom I'd given the Pentagon Papers to continue publishing. Oh, the papers are publishing, and it's all very, very good. And they don't mention that week I'm indicted eventually for 12 felony counts and 115 years in jail, possibly. The person who started the movie ends by being indicted. That would have been something of a downer, I think, for the movie.
The focus group.
They chose. Yeah. I don't blame them for not putting that in. But the earlier part, the scene, by the way, with McNamara is taken from my book Secrets. If you've seen this, where McNamara is saying to me, no, this one actually, it's from this book, if you want to know.
Oh, Secrets.
Secrets. It's taken word for word from the book, but since what we're talking about, it was a dramatic moment, not a turning point for me. McNamara asks me, I had done speeches for him and written the war plan draft, actually, in 1961, and worked under him in 62 on the Cuban Missile Crisis, so he knew me very well. I'm on the plane coming back from Vietnam because I'd been accompanying Nick Katzenbach to brief him there. So he calls me into the front compartment, as in the movie. This was exactly right. And he says, Dan, I'm having a disagreement here with Bob Comer, who I also knew from before. And Comer says, we're making great progress in Vietnam. And I say, we're losing. What do you think, Dan? He said. I said, well, Mr. Secretary, I'm more impressed. He said, compared to a year ago. I said, Mr. Secretary, I'm more impressed with how much the things are the same as a year ago. And McNamara said, you see, that's what I'm saying. We put another 100,000 troops in there. We're doing no better. That means we're really doing worse. And I said, well, that's one way of seeing it. That's interesting way to think about it. And at that moment, the pilot says, gentlemen, put your seatbelts on. We're coming in for a landing at Andrews Air Force Base. We come down very fast, actually. And within minutes, McNamara is stepping out of the plane, facing a huge circle of reporters, the television cameras and lights. It was a foggy day, actually, and these lights were shining in the fog. He's coming down the stairs, goes to the lights and says, a question is asked, sir, how are we doing in Vietnam? He said, in every dimension of the war, we are making great progress. I'm very satisfied with the progress. And I remember writing home to, actually on a tape, to my now wife, Patricia, saying, wow, I hope I'm never in a job where I have to lie like that. And, but, you know, some people thought, well, that was a turning point for you. No, it was just, I hadn't seen it in real time like that right in front of my face. You know, we're not making progress, we are making progress. That was startling, but in the movie, they give the impression that it was lies like that that turned me against the war, that they were lying.
Yes.
And it was the lying. And Harrison Salisbury, as I've often said to people, if you can't stand the government lying, you can't be in the government 2 weeks. I was in for 10 years. So it isn't just the fact that they have to lie to this audience and that audience and whatnot, or you couldn't be with high access in the government. It was what they were lying about. And the fact, which is not clear in the movie, by the way, that we're not just talking about history here, like the Pentagon Papers, which ended in 68. The movie, remember, takes place in 71. There's really almost no hint that the war is still on.
And continues.
And in fact, a year after the Pentagon Papers, the heaviest bombing in the history of the war goes on. And that's what I was concerned about, that the war was still on, was going larger. And the Post did not get that picture, by the way, at the time. History, very interesting.
And the Ken Burns series, where he begins and says, we inadvertently enter into a quagmire based on good faith. It doesn't appear that way to me.
No, well, one other thing in the Burns and Novick thing I'm thinking of, they show President No Dinh Diem, for example, as making the decision not to hold elections. And the elections in '56 were agreed, and with a lot of co-signers, to be not elections on who should run South Vietnam, but who should run Vietnam. It was understood to be a unified country, one country. That was taken for granted. Who should run Vietnam? And as Eisenhower has said in his memoirs, he never saw an estimate that Ho Chi Minh would get less than 70% of the vote in a free election in Vietnam. So he didn't want that vote because he was a communist. So they present it, though, they present it not as Eisenhower's decision, but as No Dinh Diem's decision. He was there because we counted on him to oppose that election. And if he had not opposed it, we would have moved him out.
So the
or assassinated him, as we eventually did.
So, Dan, the premise that we were promoting democracy, which would have
Was
been
a
good,
lie. Yeah.
the premise that we were promoting democracy, which would have been good faith, I believe, which I believed at the time.
Well, I believed it, but I'd been misled. In other words, I thought I was going over there to defend freedom against Stalinism. Well, the Stalinism was real. We also thought maybe people support the NLF, but they don't know any better. They're going to get treated very badly by the Stalinists when they get in. That was pretty realistic. That wasn't so wrong. But we also thought that we're doing this altruistically, basically, to support their ability to have freedom. They did not have freedom under any of the regimes we supported. And moreover, it became clear to me in '69, that's another part of the issue I won't go into detail, but I finally asked myself, how many people in Vietnam want this war to continue as opposed to wanting it over under either regime? As a matter of fact, I'll tell you, I got that at a university teaching I was talking on, and I had that thought, and I called up Mort Halpern, who was then working for Kissinger, you know, in the White House, and said in '69, he was just under Kissinger, I said, Mort, how many people do you think would prefer this war to be over under either regime? And he said, oh, about 80%. And he was working for Kissinger. I said, what do you think your boss thinks, Kissinger? He said, I've never asked him, but I would guess he thought about the same. And I said, well, Mort, then how are we justified in continuing the war in their country, you know, over there? And he said, I've never quoted him in public before, but it's a long time later now. He said, that's a good question. Let me think about it. Oh. And I don't think we did pursue it, although he was wiretapped by Kissinger for the next several years after he had left the White House for fear, in the belief that he might have leaked some information about the fact that we were bombing Cambodia secretly and illegally. And he was suspected of that at the time that I was talking to him. In fact, this conversation and others were in the secret, warrantless FBI wiretaps that were conducted at the request of Kissinger and others, 15 conversations I had with Halpern. And of course, that was very illegal at the time, and it's unconstitutional right now, I would say. Okay. But it's legal now. Under the Patriot Act, NSA, listening to such conversations, that's now legal, warrantless wiretaps. The 12 CIA assets brought up from Miami, people from the Bay of Pigs, in May 3rd, 1972, with orders to incapacitate Daniel Ellsberg totally on the steps of the Capitol on May 3rd at a rally. Well, that's not exactly legalized, but Obama has claimed the right to put out a death warrant on Anwar al-Awlaki, American citizen, born in this country, no due process, no nothing. Warrantless wiretap, CIA profile, Patriot Act, no problem. Going into my former doctor's office to find information with which to blackmail me into silence about his threats. It wasn't to stigmatize me. I was already under 12 felony counts in court, 115 years. So, as most of you know, that constitutes a certain amount of stigma at that point. But what they wanted was stuff that I didn't want out from my psychoanalyst's office that they could threaten me to put out. So all this stuff, again, the CIA could do that legally now. And all the things that were done against me have essentially been legalized, either directly, whether they're constitutional or not really been judged by the Supreme Court in most cases, but are now legalized, and the president wouldn't have to bribe people like Howard Hunt and the others to lie to the grand jury about them to protect himself. He wouldn't have to do that. That's what brought Nixon down. Mostly the acts he took against me to preserve his secret war policy, and you know, war policies all tend to be secret. My problem was this secret one was not going to succeed, was totally unjustified, was going to kill a lot of people, maybe get us into war with China and nuclear war with China, all of that. And I wanted to get in the way of that. But to do that, he wanted to shut me up. And to do that, he had to then take crimes at that point, which weren't likely to be revealed. But they were revealed, and it brought him down, and that made the war endable, after all.
And I might add that had you not revealed some of this, the illegality itself would have never been revealed, that you revealed the illegality.
Right. Actually, a lot of people had to do something very unusual to make my disclosures of any impact at all. Alex Dean had to reveal the crimes, but it was his word, John Dean, but it was his word against the president, and he wasn't going to be believed. If Alex Butterfield had not amazingly revealed the existence of the taping system as a Republican to the Watergate Committee, I believe Nixon would have stayed in office, and he would have continued the war by resuming the bombing, which he intended to do. If I can just say one couple more steps in this. After Butterfield, Nixon still, Pat Buchanan urged him, even after that, to burn the tapes on executive privilege on the White House lawn. I believe if he'd done that, he would have stayed in office, and the war would have continued. If Archibald Cox, had not called for the tapes, and then if Elliot Richardson, had not resigned rather than fire Cox, the special prosecutor, and then his replacement within minutes, Ruckelshaus, also refused. So you had 3 people out of the government on one night, Saturday Night Massacre. If that hadn't gotten the attention of the American public, there wouldn't have been another special prosecutor. Nixon stays in office, etc. Well, you could add about 50 people to that chain, each one of whom I would say had to act out of the ordinary and at risk to their careers, considerable risk, unpredictably. If any one of them had not done that, the war would have continued for at least another 2 years. Nixon would have stayed in office. I think I was part of that chain, and if I hadn't met Randy Keeler, I wouldn't have been part of that chain. So he was part of it, and the 5,000 other people who went to prison were part of it.
This is an admonition for us today, really, when we hear things like the president threatening to annihilate an entire country, North Korea, for example, committing genocide over a country publicly, and suffering no reprimand from his own party or from the press or anything commensurate with the magnitude of that threat. That is unambiguously a violation of all principles of the laws of war. And to do it publicly and brazenly and in a triumphalist manner is shocking. And I think that it's incumbent upon us to call upon especially any colleagues we have in Washington to speak out in some way or form, to have some courage, because the stakes have gotten very high. And I want to now segue into the other documents that you were copying and why you made the decision to release the Pentagon Papers. But tell us about the other documents you were copying that actually, I think, have more severe consequences even than an illegal war that killed millions of innocent people, tens of thousands of American soldiers, degraded our national honor, split our culture, but there's something even greater than that you're now talking about. What is that? What bring us to that?
Okay, in 1961, as a consultant to McGeorge Bundy, who had just gone into the White House as National Security Assistant, actually, I've named some of these people already before. I was working on modified plans that were totally drastically changing the Eisenhower plans for general nuclear war. I was given that job by a chain down from McNamara. Any chance of getting some water, by the way? I really need. Could I grab one of those? Okay. In the course of that, I wrote a bunch of, thank you. Here, we got it. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. I wrote a question for the Secretary of Defense, and I showed it to Bob Comer that I mentioned earlier, who was the Deputy Assistant Secretary, the one who was on the plane later, in, when was that? 66. So 5 years earlier, I gave Bob Comer this list of questions, and he picked out one of them to send to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the name of the President, instead of the Secretary of Defense. And that, I'm going to summarize it here because we don't have much time, but it's more in detail in this book. The question was, if your plans are carried out as planned, if you hit the targets you intend to hit, that you're planned and so forth, how many people will die? And I'm summarizing here a little bit because we got answers very quickly. And the answer was 600 million people, or 100 Holocausts, if our plan for first strike was carried out. Now, I mentioned the first strike business, meaning the first of the superpowers to launch a strike against the homeland of the other. Distinguish that from first use against anybody, for instance, North Korea. But a first strike aimed at disarming the Soviet Union was our commitment under NATO, and still is, actually, both first use and first strike if necessary. And it was always assumed that if they went against Berlin, which was 200 miles inside East Germany, and had 22 Soviet armored divisions in the vicinity of Berlin, there was no way to protect that other than to threaten, and if necessary, carry out nuclear first use. And our plan was not basically, under Eisenhower in particular, for a demonstrative use of short-range weapons. It was go all out. If we're fighting Soviets, you go all out. Now, I knew from the plans I'd been working on, that under those conditions, our plans called for hitting every city and town in the Soviet Union and China.
And China.
Because even if this was a Berlin case, or a Soviet use against West Germany, or something that arose in an uprising in East Europe that somehow we became involved in, or against Yugoslavia or Iran, as had risen before. Fighting now, nothing to do with China. We were going to hit China as well. We weren't just going to destroy the Soviet Union and the USSR, but China also. So the immediate effects within months from radioactive fallout and whatnot would be 300 in the USSR and China alone, 325 million people. Another 100 million in East Europe, these satellite countries, the slave nations, we call them. 100 million of them were going to die because they had air defenses in them, they had command and control, various things we were going to hit. 100 million of our allies in West Europe were going to be killed, by this estimate, by the radioactive fallout from our attacks in East Europe, depending on which way the wind blew. Now, none of this had anything to do with what the Russians would do and their ability to destroy, and their readiness to destroy Germany and the rest of Europe was total. They were going to annihilate Europe. But even without them, if the wind, depending on the season, was in the wrong direction, we would kill 100 million. They were hostages to us, to our attack. As, by the way, the people of South Korea and Japan are totally hostage to fire and fury, nuclear fire or fury, or a two-sided nuclear war in Korea. As Senator Lindsey Graham puts it, the president had told him, this year, all the casualties, which would be enormous, terrible, would be over there. Okay. Quote, all the casualties will be over there, not over here. Well, in 61, under Eisenhower and then under Kennedy, we were going to destroy our NATO allies as collateral damage. Okay, so I thought of that as the most evil plan that had ever existed. How not? How else to see that? And yet I knew that it was not done by evil people. They were people I had beer with in the evening and ate dinner with. They were my colleagues, ordinary Americans, colonels, generals, majors. I was sure there was plans like this in the Soviet Union and elsewhere, as there are. And it was hard for me at that point in 61, I had just turned 30. Hard to imagine we were going to get away with this, that I wasn't reading the way the world was going to end. Now, 22 years later, in 83, 20 years later, 40 years into the nuclear era, we found something else. Our plans for hitting those cities, which were going to burn them, were going to loft smoke into the stratosphere where it would not rain out. And it turns out, in the latest calculations, would persist for a decade around the world. Not radioactive fallout, which was not going to kill everybody. The smoke was going to kill all the harvests. And that has been confirmed times over by scientists now in the last 11 years, since 2007, that these early results were not only right, but the situation was worse than Carl Sagan knew.
We've now, much worse, we've now found from Dr. Robach's studies in Rutgers University that if a mere less than 1% of the existing 14,900 weapons
were to be used. The estimates that they did the studies between India and Pakistan, if 100 went off, it would throw in excess of 5 million tons of soot into the stratosphere. That's less than 100. 5 million tons of soot into the stratosphere, not even addressing radioactive fallout or the deaths from the fires, but that this would dramatically impact the ozone layer and render agriculture as we know it insufficient to support civilization. So in any of our first strike plans are all in excess of 100. So we've now moved from mutually assured destruction to self-assured destruction, and that's the current plan. So you were accessing the original doomsday plan, and we don't have a lot of time. I want to get to where we are now. I was saying, you're one of the top experts on nuclear planning. You copied the material along with the Pentagon Papers. You've been studying it all this time. I want this last bit of time to talk about where we are now. What are the plans now? How do they work? What's at risk? What are the lies and truths about it?
Okay. We now still have, after dismantling, putting on the shelf at least, 85% of our weapons. We still have far more, several times more than is needed to cause nuclear winter. So there's no real change, especially because the intercontinental ballistic missiles, the land-based long-range missiles on each side, are vulnerable to each other and are subject to launch on warning. They will be destroyed if an alarm comes that enemy missiles are coming in. The president, supposedly, or somebody, has minutes to decide whether or not to launch the missiles, use them, or lose them. They won't make any difference, actually, to the outcome in the later nuclear winter because everybody is going to starve from the sub-launched missiles, which we can't target. But at least we can get those ICBMs, and so the planning is entirely to get them off, despite the fact that there have been half a dozen major false alarms in the last half century, which have brought people to the verge of launching those weapons, in particular, both in Russia and in the US, including in the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which I participated. So you have two doomsday machines on hair triggers. You could remove the hair trigger just by getting rid of the ICBMs on one side even, or better on both sides. The president strongly considered that in 2016, Obama. But no, it didn't pass. James Mattis, by the way, now Secretary of Defense, 4-star Marine General, had recommended disbanding the so-called land-based leg of the triad. The triad is land-based missiles, bombers, and sub-launch missiles. Get rid of the land-based missiles. They're vulnerable, you don't need them, and they're dangerous. They are the trigger on this. So he recommended getting rid of them. At his confirmation hearings, he was a little more judicious, and he said, we should consider getting rid of the land-based missiles. That was a couple months before he got into the BSEC-DEF. Now, the nuclear posture review, he's been subject to, we don't want to do that in the Pentagon, and the military-industrial complex doesn't want to do that. So we are going now to rebuild under him, as under Obama, this entire ICBM complex. In other words, rebuild the Doomsday Machine. There is no excuse for it. It is unconscionable, but it's the way things are done, and there are profits and jobs and votes in making these vehicles, Lockheed and Boeing and Raytheon, whether they are dangerous or not, like the anti-ballistic missile systems we're about to see, which will not protect us, but which make as much profit and whatever as building it as if they did protect us.
You mentioned the nuclear posture review. By congressional mandate, every 5 years there has to be a review that articulates why we have them, what they will cost, what the posture is. So the latest one that was just done postulates an expenditure of excess in $1.2 trillion.
Not allowing for inflation, so that brings it up to 1.7 trillion.
Right,
So
and Senator Markey recently told me, he says that his calculations are 1.8. But what's a couple $100 billion
Who's
here
counting?
or there?
Yes.
Who's counting? And of course it will stimulate a similar modernization and arms race with other countries. So it's just $1 trillion here, $1 trillion other countries. it is all of the money that would be needed to save the climate, address poverty, change the relationships between states. But I think one of the most serious parts as a lawyer of the current nuclear posture review is it says that we need nuclear weapons in relation to cyber threats, which means that as long as there's the potential for cyber attack, we need the nuclear weapons. Now, we have an obligation by law under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to negotiate the elimination of nuclear weapons in good faith. And that's a legal duty that we have. As it's great to speak with colleagues because you all have read the Constitution and you're familiar with the Supremacy Clause, which makes treaties the supreme law of the land, to which even the President of the United States has an obligation to adhere to. And this nuclear posture review essentially says that as long as there's cyber world, we're going to have nuclear weapons. That is a new doctrine, and in my opinion, undermines good faith. And I believe that our silence in the face of this dynamic thrust to reinvigorate the Doomsday Machine, to reinvigorate these threats that we thought we'd gotten rid of, is hazardous. I mean, it's just shockingly hazardous. And Dan is one of the only voices really laying it out specifically as an insider with the details of how it works. And I recommend strongly this book, The Doomsday Machine.
There's been a lot of discussion in the last month of whether James Mattis, for example, could check the president from launching a full-scale or limited nuclear war. There is an answer to that. The answer is no, he cannot do that. Constitutionally, legally, practically, he can't do that. However, this question of whether Mattis would necessarily disobey an illegal order has been subject to a lot of testimony. We just got an answer for that last Saturday. Mm-hmm. He did obey a clearly, blatantly illegal order and constitutional order for an attack on Syria, which was not in response to an attack on us and was not called for by the Security Council. So that was a clear illegal order. I would say he served the country quite well that particular week because if the reports are correct, had he simply resigned or refused, he would have been quickly replaced and the attack would have been larger. It would not still have been just as illegal, but by every account in the news, had he refused, he could say, Bolton or whoever, and will influence the president, they wanted a larger attack on the war. But supposing now it was not Syria, which is a non-nuclear state. It has weapons of mass destruction, perhaps chlorine, it's alleged, but those are not nuclear weapons. Supposing it's North Korea, what might Mattis do at that point? Well, he knows that it would be disastrous to attack North Korea. He's said that more or less. I am certain, by the way, that there are not just dozens, but hundreds of estimates in the Pentagon right now that show what the estimates would be of the consequences of attacking North Korea and the back and forth. It would not be nuclear winter. There's not enough cities to burn in North Korea to do that, and they don't have enough weapons to do that to us. It would not cause billions of deaths like an India-Pakistan war, but millions, 1,000 times less, but more deaths in a week than the world has ever seen. Plus a totally changed atmosphere that I think would make the Doomsday Machines irreparable. So I have something for Mattis that I think he could do. He could actually reveal those plans, those estimates, those forecasts. He could do what I did, essentially. He could do what Chelsea Manning at their level or Ed Snowden did. He could reveal it, but he could do what McNamara did not do, resist the thing in public and before Congress, at the cost of his career, not at the cost of going to prison. He could declassify that stuff if he wanted. There'd be no question of 793, paragraphs D and E and so forth. But his career as an official of the government would be pretty much over. He would be averting the first two-sided nuclear war. This is the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis in which I participated, in which a president is making direct threats of armed conflict against a nuclear weapons state, North Korea. Not Iran, not Iraq, not Syria, but North Korea. A two-sided nuclear war. As I say, it wouldn't be the whole thing. I have in my life participated in 2 moral catastrophes as a participant. Vietnam and the nuclear arms race. And I was part of those, absolutely. We've had some since then, but the big one lies ahead. Nuclear war is a catastrophe waiting to happen, and we will not escape it, in my belief, without more moral courage than we've ever seen before in this country.